the planet needs to be saved in California, is a weird idea. If Californians really wanted to do stuff for the planet, they would make it really easy to build to get the population of California up to a massive level, because living in California has a smaller carbon footprint, most obviously.
Welcome to the Gold Exchange Podcast, where we untangle market and policy complexity using timeless economic principles. For show notes and archives, go to goldexchangepodcast.com.
Welcome back to the Gold Exchange Podcast. My name is Benjamin Nadelstein from Monetary Metals. I am joined by New York Times best-selling author and George Mason economics professor, Bryan Caplan. Bryan, how you doing?
Doing fantastic, buddy.
Bryan, you have put out a new book called Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. This is a non-fiction graphic novel, which means it combines words and pictures to make academic research on housing actually a fun, edge-of-your-seat experience. I've read the book. It is incredible. I urge you to read it as well. Bryan, can you give us a main overview for the argument for housing deregulation? Most people think, oh my God, if they start deregulating housing, people are going to build a pink, 10-story building next to me. They're going to destroy the nature. My favorite worm is going to be killed. What do you say to people who think housing deregulation? You're crazy.
Well, a good way to start is say, there's been a very large rise in the price of housing over the last 40 years, a lot more than inflation. It's not just inflation. Housing is rising more than inflation. It's risen a lot more in some places than others. Infamously, in the Bay Area, it's gotten really crazy. And then the question is why? There's a usual story about how competitive markets work, which is if demand goes up, price goes up. But in the long run, when price goes up, price is above average cost, which basically is an announcement to the entire business community, make more of this thing because it's like a license to print money. And as a result, in the long run, you get entry, prices go back down to average cost. This is the way markets normally work. It's the way housing markets used to work. About 40 or 50 years ago, it seems like they stopped working this way. Why? Well, there's some very smart people who looked into it, and almost everybody, regardless of their political views, comes away and says, it's government. It's government that did it. Government prevents the construction of new housing. It doesn't matter how valuable the housing is compared to the cost of making it. It's so hard to get the permission that we have this permanent situation of prices well above cost. And if you actually try to measure how much, it looks like averaging over the US, we're talking roughly housing prices are at double the cost of production. A lot more in some places like San Francisco might be 10 times the cost of production, physical cost. And on the other hand, in some rural areas may be very little effect at all. But essentially, we have roughly doubled the price of the second most fundamental necessity of life. Food is the more important, but after food, it's shelter. We've doubled the cost of that. Deregulation is a totally realistic, pragmatic way to get prices back down to earth.
So, Bryan, why don't I start with some common objections you probably hear all the time? The book does a great job actually showing, not even just telling, but showing you why maybe some of these objections are at least overblown, right? Everyone can say, okay, yeah, maybe a bird's nest is going to get trampled, but a $4 billion housing project, that's $4 billion worth of value.
Yes.
So let me start with some objections. So you hear this one all the time. Okay, well, I'm living in, let's say, California, and I have a really nice neighborhood. There's all these families who live here. There's, people walking by. And if you just build a huge apartment complex, why, that would junk up the sewer system. There'd be people everywhere. The traffic would be crazy. I mean, you really want a huge apartment condo next to my little family unit?
Right. Of course, they got to buy it. That's important. They don't just buy one house. If you're building a giant apartment, you buy up a bunch of houses. If you just think of it from the point of view of the complainers, like, well, you might get to be one of these people who gets bought out for a fabulous amount of money. If you say, oh, I don't care about money. Yeah, that's easy to say, but actions speak louder than words. When people get offers like that, they generally do take them because there's a lot of places that you could live. And do you really have to be actually there when you're getting a fantastic offer to be someplace else? The main issue is that all change bothers somebody, but markets are a great way to say, let's put some money on it and see how much you really want to keep things the same and how much are people willing to pay to change it. There's always, of course, some complaints. The most fundamental point is, look, there's a bunch of complaints, and most of the complaints, there's something to them, but there's also a bunch of good things that happen that almost nobody mentions, right? Well, how about all the families that now get to live in that neighborhood and they'll enjoy it? How about them? barely ever get brought up. Or if you say, oh, I don't like the traffic. How about having some friends for your kids within walking distance? That's another realistic possibility. Now, you may say, well, okay, but who's to say which one is bigger? Even to have that objection is saying, yeah, well, then you probably shouldn't be getting so upset. If it's just a toss up or you don't know, then why are you going and getting angry or going to meetings or putting up protest signs? But more importantly, we actually do have a strong set of evidence that in general, the good outweighs the bad. What's the evidence? Well, like I said, actions speak louder than words. It is totally standard for people who live in high density areas with lots of people to complain. And yet it is a simple fact that there is a place out in the middle of nowhere that has not, where all their complaints are no longer true. There are plenty of places in America you live with no traffic, no parking, no noise, but also no restaurants, very few job opportunities, very few friend opportunities, very few cultural opportunities. And what we see is that most people are very glad to pay a lot of extra money to get the package of good plus bad, to get all the bad stuff that people bring plus all the good stuff, and people pay a big upcharge for that, which shows that people generally actually like the effects of density despite all of the complaining.
Brian, I find that an interesting point, which is, hey, listen, on net, it might be unclear. Are, cities and lots of housing and deregulation a good idea or a bad idea? And we should, be much closer to, single family zoning and all these things. And the question, in some ways, answers itself. Look at the coolest places on the planet. There are, Texas, Austin, Singapore, Hong Kong. No one's like, oh my goodness, there's so much housing in Hong Kong. It's great. That's why people like Hong Kong. In the book, you even mentioned the Amalfi Coast, right? Oh, we should have it completely untouched, just sand and water. But actually, what makes the Amalfi Coast so interesting and what a beautiful place is the actual human element, is the building element.
Yeah, it's the blending. It's developing a beautiful area and making it better, which is what a developer wants to do. Just the very word, a developer wants to develop things. They want to go and take something that's pretty good and make it better so that they can make a pile of money.
And it seems the problem there is the pile of money at the end, right? Everyone likes software developers. I mean, they make money too, but it feels like the pile of money portion is the part that people generally don't like. It feels like, hey, landlords are generally hated compared to software developers. Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. And it is quite odd because we don't have many movies about how farmers are evil, or even agribusiness is not considered very evil. But my friend Michael Manville, just down the road from UCLA, did this very cool paper where he actually asked people about, would you approve this housing project? Everybody got the same hypothetical with one variation. In one version, they mentioned that a developer would make a lot of money, and the other one they didn't. And just mentioning the developer would make a lot of money crashes support by like 30 percentage points. So there is some kind of strange antipathy towards people that supply housing. Now, as to why that is, I don't have any really good story about that. There is a general distaste for business and the rich, but as to why this particular business gets so much ire, it's hard really to fathom what it is about it. There is kind of the idea of, well, I live here and you're intruding on my way of life. Well, I mean, but you could say the same about a lot of other businesses too. You go and you broadcast some TV shows that I don't like, and then my kids are watching something that bothers me. Perhaps there is some very primitive sense of the land is my home and this is sacred, which would make sense coming back from prehistoric times. So that's the best I got. I can't prove that or anything, but maybe.
So, Brian, we have a lot of people who listen to the show that are investors of one kind or another. Some are real estate investors, obviously lots of gold investors and precious metals as well. So when someone is saying, hey, I'm a developer, or hey, I'm a landlord, maybe you can tell them about why you think housing is the panacea policy and put some ammo in their belt. Because most people, they say, oh, you're a developer, or oh my goodness, you're a landlord, and they really have no good response. So what is the panacea policy? Give us some ammo in our belts for investors.
I mean, I would just start with I'm a terrible person because I provide the second most fundamental necessity. Yeah. It's like, without people like me, you would be unhoused. Like, people like me build stuff. Why am I the bad guy? I do something totally useful that you enjoy every day. Like, I can't even imagine what the complaint is on some fundamental level. Like, why would I be the villain? But on top of that, yes, a lot of what motivated me to do the book was not just the research saying that government is strangling housing supply and has drastically raised the price. And you can combine that with the fact that this is a large share of people's budget. So it's a doubling the price of something that's really important. But what really motivated me to do the book is to realize there's a lot of other policies, a lot of other problems rather, that seem not really related to housing that actually are closely related to housing. And that's why I do call it the panacea policy, not literally a panacea. It won't cure every possible problem. It won't cure cancer. But nevertheless, there's a lot of problems that people complain about and feel pretty hopeless about. And I say that not only are there solutions, but there's one solution for all of them at once, and that is deregulating housing. To start with some really simple ones, inequality. Turns out that a large reason why inequality's increased is just that people who were lucky and bought homes in desirable areas when they were cheap 30 or 40 years ago are now worth 10 million bucks. And the people whose parents didn't buy in those areas don't get any piece of that, and they're doing a lot worse. The rise in capital share that you might have heard about, made famous by French economist Thomas Piketty, turns out when you really separate the numbers, it's just housing that's rising in its share. And what we think of as capital includes housing, just sort of casually as without really thinking about it. And if you split out housing and other capital that we think that's more stereotypical, the stereotypical factory type capital, that is not gained in its share. It's just housing. It's not this inexorable playing out of the logic of capitalism, but rather it is the playing out of the illogic of government strangling this fundamental industry. Social mobility, another good example. There used to be a nearly foolproof way for someone to get upward mobility in America, and that's pack up your car and move to a high wage part of the country. Because historically, the cost of living did not vary that much by area of the country, but wages did. And so all you need to do is move to the high wage place and you've got yourself a better standard of living. Now there's still high wage parts of the country, but unfortunately they generally have much higher housing costs, so high, in fact, that normally low-income workers, low-skilled workers lose money by moving to the high-income areas. A Mississippi janitor gets poorer, not richer, when he moves to the Bay Area. Right. I talk about fertility. One of the really big things going on with fertility is when housing prices are high, people keep living with their parents. And when you keep living with the parents, you don't get married, very likely, and you're especially unlikely to have kids. So deregulate housing, people are going to move out sooner, and this will probably speed up family formation and number of kids that people have. There's, of course, environmental complaints. Since you're in California, you know how aggravating Californians are, right? I'm from California too. It's like, you don't know what you think you know, Californians. You are not in possession of a superior enlightenment. You just aren't. Right. And standard thing in California is passing laws to protect the planet in California. What's the result of that? Well, the result is that people leave California, which has a very nice climate, which means that people living there don't spend much on heating or cooling. And then where do they go? They go to other parts of the country where they will have higher heating and cooling costs. The planet needs to be saved in California, is a weird idea. If Californians really wanted to do stuff for the planet, they would make it really easy to build to get the population of California up to a massive level, because living in California has a smaller carbon footprint, most obviously. Right. There's that. Another big one, there's been a lot of talk in recent decades of the plight of the non-college male in America. We've got declining income. We've got falling life expectancy, high rates of alcohol and substance abuse and suicide, right? All this stuff, the standard story from Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton and my dissertation advisor, Ann Case, is that non-college males haven't adapted well to technological change. There's been a big decline in traditional manly employment. They're not going to learn to code, and they don't like service sector jobs. All right. So this often leads people to say, well, then we need to go and cut off foreign trade in order to revive traditional manufacturing to save these poor non-college males. I have a piece where I just go over the math and said, even if you just cut off all foreign trade, it really wouldn't make that much difference. Most of the reason why manufacturing employment has fallen is just rising productivity per worker. We're getting so good at making this stuff. We don't need many workers to do our manufacturing. On the other hand, if we were to deregulate housing, that is overwhelmingly done by non-college males. The technological progress has not been that great. And so not only would this mean that non-college males could afford to get their own nice houses, but they would be employed in building them. And this is a huge sector. We're talking about 10 million workers. If we were to double it, that is making a huge dent in this problem of what gets called deaths of despair. So again,
the panacea policy really is a panacea. You also mentioned crime as well. Hey, if
mm-hmm,
there's an unlit area and there's,
mm-hmm,
parking lot there and
yes,
kids are, doing
mm-hmm,
drugs
especially
or
vacant lots. So here there's a very cool experiment in Philadelphia where the authors begin with just some facts. 15% of urban land in the US is vacant. And it's like, what? Like, why is it vacant? All right, there's this story. Well, I'm speculating in case it goes up even more. But a lot of the vacancy is just caused by I can't get the permission to go and build anything, or at least to build what I want. So I'm just going to sit around and hope my brother-in-law gets elected to the housing commission or something like that. All right. So anyway, the authors of this one paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences said, hey, what if we get permission just to go and beautify these vacant lots, which are normally dens of crime? So if you're going to go and have a gang hangout, a vacant lot's a perfect place for it. So let's go and do an experiment. We'll beautify a random hearth. Right. This is a key thing if you were a social science nerd. If you do all, then it's hard to know what happened. But if you do a random hearth, then it is like testing a drug where you see, well, the people that randomly were given the drug did better or worse. And so we can find out how well the drug really works. So what they did is they randomly took half the vacant lots in Philadelphia. They cleaned up the trash, planted grass, planted trees, benches, little picket fence, right? And then they saw what happened to crime. And it really did actually reduce crime. Now, what's interesting about this piece is if you read through it to the end, there's a section where they say, we're not talking about gentrification. God knows we would never want to let anybody build anything. We just want to plant grass. Don't be mad at us. And I'm reading this as like, how about we go and put buildings there? If planting grass makes the criminals not want to be there, how about putting in a nice apartment complex that'll probably really reduce the crime there? Again, it's all based upon this strange bigotry against real estate development and the refusal to accept the basic economics of when you make housing abundant, you make it cheap.
So, Bryan, I want to cut in here. So, for some investors that are listening to this, they're saying, okay, well, if I had an option to go into a different, maybe I was going to be a real estate trader or a stock trader, it sounds like real estate is highly regulated. But on the other hand, it feels like real estate prices kind of just have to keep going up, right? If there's low supply and lots of demand because our population keeps growing, isn't it a great time to buy real estate as an asset or real estate investment trusts? Because over time, the price of housing just has to go up.
So it depends on to what extent you think that's already reflected in current market prices, right? So if you're the first person on earth to figure this out, then you're in for making a pile of money. If you are the millionth person who's figured this out, then you're not going to make any money off of this. The only reason to say maybe there still is this opportunity is just that it is actually pretty hard to go and buy houses and then keep them off the market in pristine condition. So, like if you just thought that the price of, say, I don't know, this microphone was going to go up a lot, then you might actually just buy 1 million units, put it in a warehouse for a very low cost per microphone. It stays wrapped in plastic. As long as the rain doesn't get in, it's going to be perfectly fine. Housing does not work that way. If you were to go and just buy it and sit on it, you would have to be worrying about squatters and stuff like that, as well as maintenance. So that, so if you had some good way of handling that problem, this is why, for example, if you had some, your brother is happy to go and rent from you and you give him a little bit off the rent and then you trust him a lot. So that, you're in that kind of a favorable situation, then this probably is pretty sensible. There actually was a house in my neighborhood after the Great Recession that was just empty for like 10 years. And I was sorely tempted to go and buy it and just take advantage of the fact I live on the street. So I'll know if any squatters are there. But my parents actually put most of their investments into real estate. And while they did well in the end, it was so hard on them to go and handle rental properties. So I never want to do that myself.
Well, Bryan, we wrote a book for real estate investors. It's talking about how to earn passive income in gold and why that helps real estate investors. And two of the points that you mentioned are relevant. One is that obviously housing has a large cost to it, whether that be time, you got to go deal with renters or squatters, God forbid, and it's a very difficult asset to store, and it's not exactly fungible. So if you have a house in Arizona, that's not the exact same thing as a gold bar in Arizona or a gold bar in New York. you can kind of send gold around quite quickly. And the storage costs for gold can be quite small. $10 million worth of gold, you could probably fit in a couple suitcases versus $10 million house. That's quite a big house. So
Yep.
interesting asset discussion there. I want to pivot
I
because,
feel a heist movie coming on here.
well, I hope not. So
It's all insured, right? Your gold's
it is all
insured.
insured.
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
yes. So what?
Oh, phew.
Well, one thing for real estate people to think about is that it is quite simple to insure your home, because most people don't want to burn down their own house, and you can also tell with some investigative techniques whether this house was burned down with malice, if there was an accident, and how much damages are owed. Versus gold can be quite difficult, and that's why it's very difficult to insure gold at home, because most people can say, "Hey, I lost it," or "Someone stole it," and it's quite difficult to say, "Oh, yes, this was clearly a case of theft," or if the owner themselves lost the gold. So it is quite difficult to insure gold at home. I wouldn't say impossible. It's technically partially possible, but quite difficult. So that's why some people opt to store their gold professionally, which has costs. Other people, of course, use monetary metals. We cover the insurance. We also pay passive income in gold. Let's change quickly here. So you wrote this book. It's a nonfiction graphic novel. Most people think, oh, you're a boring old professor. It's going to be some boring old housing book. That is absolutely not the case. And you said you wanted to write the book because you wanted to fight aesthetics with aesthetics. So can you tell us a bit about that? And are all of your upcoming works going to be graphic novels? Do you find that that's really a better way to kind of get this information out there?
Not all, but I'm definitely going to keep one foot in the graphic novel field because they are so much fun to write, and it's just such an amazing intellectual experience to get to do it. The story here is, I am an economist. I think in terms of numbers, weighing dollars, but when you actually talk about housing in particular, it's obvious for a lot of people it's not about numbers at all. It's just about aesthetics. I find that beautiful. I don't want to talk about the cost or what the value is. I just want to go and look at pretty stuff, and I don't want it touched. Right. So one thing is just to say, well, you're crazy. I can't deal with people like you. And then you write that person off as someone you might persuade. What I wanted to do in this book is to say, all right, look, how do you know it would be ugly? What makes you so sure that development would be bad? Look, it hasn't happened yet. You didn't get to look at it. You never got to compare what you see right now that you like with an alternative. You've done that kind of testing when you go to the optician where it's like, is it better like A or better like B, right? A or B. If you don't get to see both options, then you aren't really in a position to make an informed aesthetic judgment. What I wanted to do in this book is to actually draw the alternatives, say, all right, here's the world that you see, which you are so concerned to protect on aesthetic grounds. Here is an alternate world that doesn't really exist, but I'm showing it to you through the power of graphic novels. And then how about now? Right now, when you go and compare the two, one of my favorite pages involves one shot of the actual undeveloped California coastline, another one of the very same coastline, except it's got a whole lot of nice housing on it. I at least say, and I think most people who just look at the pictures without an axe to grind will say, yeah, I like the picture with development better, which makes sense because the most treasured coastlines in the world are, like you were mentioning, the Amalfi Coast, places like that, where there's people that start with natural beauty and then they augment it with human habitation to generate something that is a beloved tourist destination for all of humanity. So that's what I'm going with. Same thing with, you want to tear down some historic buildings. That's terrible. These are beautiful buildings. Well, often they are beautiful, but why do you think what we're going to build instead will be ugly? Maybe we're going to build something gorgeous. How do you know? What makes you so sure that the worst will happen? And honestly, I think this is a lot of the basis for support for housing regulation. Is just leaping to the most negative, paranoid conclusion and treating it as fact, rather than say, how about we judge the future by the past? How often was it the case in the past that when historic stuff was torn down, it really was replaced by something worse? In the book, I actually have a time machine because it's fiction, and so I can do that. Well, that part is fiction. Anyway, I go and show the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which is a gorgeous building that was torn down in 1929 to make room for the Empire State Building, which I trust almost everyone will say is way better. Right? That's the kind of thing that I'm going for, fighting aesthetics with aesthetics.
In one part in the book, you mentioned, hey, the Eiffel Tower, when that was first built, people were like,
Mhm.
oh, it's an eyesore. Why did we build this thing? And
Yep.
now that is one of the most
Mhm.
incredible, pieces of
Yep.
architecture in the world. So if we had followed the
Mhm.
anti-Bryan Caplan
Yep.
kind of people who just complain about everything, we wouldn't
Yeah.
have the Eiffel Tower.
Yep. Right. And like honestly, so many people say like you can't touch Paris. It's like it could be improved. It could totally be improved. Right. And like I'll say my big aesthetic objection to Paris is there's not enough variation in color. When you look at that view from the Eiffel Tower, oh, it's so gorgeous. A bunch of 6-story buildings, all of the same color, pretty much. Like it's boring. Like we could do way better than that. Also worth pointing out, even the regulation they have has not stopped the monstrosities like the Pompidou Center. So let's, if you like, and if you like that, I'm like, all right, then we're never going to agree on aesthetics. But yeah, like bulldoze that thing, put up a skyscraper that's awesome.
So, Brian, I had a kind of theoretical question for you. A lot of times people talk about something called a public good, which I'll have you
Mm-hmm.
explain what that is. And they say there's really no way to solve this. Yep, we got to get the
Mm-hmm.
government in here. We got to solve
Mm-hmm.
this public good problem. A lot of ways, it feels like housing could actually be solved with a similar solution that people have found to public goods, which is you buy the entire thing or
Mm-hmm.
you have options on the entire property or whatever the problem may be. And then since you own it, you have an incentive to make it better. So
Mm-hmm.
someone would say, how are
Oh
we going
yeah.
to defend this whole city? Because there's a problem here, right? If I pay protection, they're not going to use the anti-ballistic missiles on just my house. That's not how ballistic missiles
Mm-hmm.
work, right? So how can we
Mm-hmm.
protect this whole city? That seems like a big public good problem. Let's get the government in here. They'll protect this entire swath of land. But you can do the same thing, right? You can have an option contract on every single house in the
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood, and then you have, an interest in making sure those houses have defense, which should increase their value, so on and so forth. So how do you see options contracts kind of figuring out
Mm-hmm.
things that people used to say, okay, this is impossible? And is there an opportunity for investors to do something like a, self-styled city where they say, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
buy a lot of land here. I'm going to make it my own. We're going to get rid of all these housing regulations and maybe make some money that way.
Hmm. So I was just down in Honduras where my friends at Prospera, the charter city, are totally into this stuff. It's a really intuitive idea, the entrepreneurial community. There's one landowner who owns it all, and then they basically go and have contracts with everybody there. They're able to go and purchase an enormous quantity of land. So you're able to actually have a bunch of things. It's like, well, like this would affect that. This would affect the other thing. It would affect it positively, would affect it negatively. Let's factor all of this in. Very reasonable idea. It's the principle of every shopping mall. What's striking is that government very strictly regulates this stuff too. If you're a real estate developer with a very large plot of land, the local government will generally come in and say, you've got to give every house a minimum amount of land. And often the minimum is a pile of land, like an acre. So this is a case where the most logical thing would precisely be to say, you have factored everything into your decision already. It's such a large plot. All the effects of every neighbor and every other neighbor are part of your profit maximizing calculus. So you do whatever you want, but of course, they're not allowed to do whatever they want. Same thing goes for commercial developers. You want to do a mall, you might think they have every incentive to consider all the effects. And yet, there is very strict regulation of how much space they have to allocate to parking. And the rule is insane. Standard US parking law for commercial developments is you have to have enough parking spaces so that there is a space for every single customer on the busiest day of the year, Black Friday, if you charge zero for parking. The result is that we have enormous parking lots, which are almost always empty almost all the time. The alternative would be the free market approach, where you can build as much parking as you want. If you charge too much for parking or it's inconvenient, then people won't want to go to your mall, and it's your choice as to how you want to handle it. Right now, in terms of entrepreneurial opportunities, they are there. I don't think that I have any special knowledge of how to do it, because the thing is you have to navigate government regulation to do this kind of thing too, and it's often pretty strict. The main place where you are most free to build is in the middle of nowhere. Unfortunately, you've got to figure out why anyone would want to live in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes they do. Sometimes you can tempt them into it, and that's how every new community gets started. But if you know that, you don't need advice from me. Then you've got a superpower already. I neglected to put this into the book, but totally worth pointing out that the federal government especially, but also state governments, own a crazy amount of land in the United States. This is all under the influence of the ideology of conservationism. It's nothing to do with government owns the land people don't want. You can just look at a map and see that areas that became part of the U.S. before the rise of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir almost all privately owned. Rest of the country, largely owned by government. Right. But anyway, one striking thing about this is if we could get this government land privatized, this would give an ideal opportunity for, say, an Elon Musk to buy 100 square miles and then do an extreme version of this. And he probably does have the superpower that he could get people to move to a totally undeveloped area because it would be Elon Town. He would probably just start by putting a headquarters there. So he's got his workers and then put a bunch of other cool stuff there. And then word gets out and he's got free advertising by virtue of his fame. So he's a natural candidate for doing this if we could actually privatize a pile of government land, which is like pulling teeth, unfortunately.
Well, I will happily move to Elon Town. If you move, Bryan, sounds like a kind of interesting thing. Okay, so next question here. So we've talked a bit about housing. We've talked a bit about, hey, there's all these different problems where the government regulation kind of stops this, as well as the voters who kind of have an aesthetic displeasure with lots of things that if you really looked at it kind of more neutrally or on net, you would say, okay, maybe this is not a big deal. You've written tons of other books, Bryan. The other graphic novel you wrote was about open borders. I'll be your regular citizen. Most people hear open borders. Nobody believes that. That's crazy. Open borders.
And also,
Bryan,
it's what we've had for the last 4 years, right?
Yes.
First, no one believes it. Second, it's what we've had.
Yes.
Weird.
Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden love open borders is the claim. And also nobody believes it. So, okay, question. I'll start with some of the basic objections against. And by the way, go buy this book. It's the coolest thing. You can read it for your kids. You can give it to grandma, and you can give it to a research student who's doing economics. These are all great books for kind of all levels. I highly recommend. So let's start. Most people here, Bryan, you support open borders. That sounds crazy. What happens when an illegal immigrant from, let's say, Mexico crosses the border, then they have kids here. That means they're going to get free schooling and free healthcare. And if they break their knee, America pays for it. So how could they be a net positive? This seems crazy. You want more of this?
Right. So first thing, the fiscal effects is something where people have very strong opinions about it, but it's math. And having strong opinions about math does not make a lot of sense. I've never successfully solved a math problem by getting angry about it or hopeful about it. You solve math problems by just calming down and doing the numbers very carefully. Almost no one with an opinion about the fiscal effects of immigration has even looked at the numbers. Just fact, right? Instead, how do people get their opinions? They use a philosophy. So if you don't like immigration, then you say, fiscal effect of immigration is terrible. If you like immigration, fiscal effect's great. Right? These are both totally corrupt ways to form opinions about this question. What is a non-corrupt way? Actually go and read the numbers. Now, there's a lot of different numbers. Yeah, well, what I would say is put aside numbers from advocacy groups. Right? They're highly biased. Try to find people who are just boring quants with no dog in the fight, just doing math, such as National Academy of Sciences. This is the main source that I relied upon for open borders, where they go through it. Now, here's the thing. This is actually very complicated. Why? Well, on the one hand, you can say, look, we've got a progressive tax system. So if you have investors that are listening, they know about progressive taxes, I assume. All right, so we got a progressive tax system. So all else equal, this is a reason to think that high earning immigrants would be a net benefit for taxpayers. Low earning immigrants would be a net burden. All right. And then you're like, all right, fine. So that's a reason to at least be concerned about having low skilled immigration. But there's a few other things to consider. One of them is that a lot of government spending is on goods that are called non-rival by economists. This means their cost doesn't vary by population. Some, of course, does. So schooling is a classic one where more students means more cost. On the other hand, regardless of your opinions on national defense, if we had a baby boom, this would not be a good reason to go and change the number of nuclear weapons we have. You can defend 50 million new babies just as easily with what we got as without those babies. And this is a large share of government spending. So when you go and do that, then it's like, all right, well, that makes that math more favorable. A good way of thinking about it is this. You go to the movie theater in the middle of the day, there's almost nobody there, even though they're charging them well below the full price of a ticket. Does that mean that they are losing money on those tickets? And the answer, of course, is no, because it's close to non-rival to let people in for a matinee. So you get any money out of them. It is actually going and giving you some extra funding. There's a bit of air conditioning, things like that. But still, that gives you an idea that It is possible to have customers that pay way less than average and are still good customers to have, right? And that's the same logic for non-rival goods for the effect of immigration on the budget. Now, another key thing is that immigrants have a big advantage. You mentioned schooling. It's true that immigrants do have kids. And if you are being tricky, you will say, well, the immigrant is an adult and doesn't go to school, so they don't cost anything, and their kids are citizens, so they're not immigrants, so that doesn't count. But obviously, letting in the immigrant means that their kids are going to be here and taxpayers will be on the hook for that. So is in fact not a good objection. What is a good objection is this. All right. Look at an American family, two parents, one kid. The parents are native born. How many people did taxpayers fund the education for? One, two, three. All right. Let's look at a family of two adult immigrants who came when they were adults and their kid. How many people in that family did American taxpayers pay for the education of? One. That's something else that tips the scales in favor of immigrants. Right. There's a lot more going on here. You may say, well, we need to consider not just the immigrant, but their kids, fine. But if we're going to consider the cost of their kids, we should also consider the tax their kids will eventually pay. All right. So you do all of this. And this is the kind of thing that National Academy of Sciences did. And what they came away with is that immigrants that have graduated from high school, which would be most immigrants from Latin America these days, actually are a net fiscal positive. To get a net fiscal, especially the young ones are net. So young adults are net fiscal positive. When you switch over to look at high school dropouts, then not so good. But again, we're talking about a smaller group. So then what do you say? All right, fine. How about we let everybody in with a high school degree or more? That's okay. Over there, I would say, look, thinking about only the fiscal effect of a person is not a good measure of their total contribution. If you think about someone who is a great entrepreneur, but they've also got a great tax attorney, so they barely pay taxes. I know that's hard, but some people pull it off by being very clever. It's like, well, is that person a drain on America? It's like, well, they didn't pay much in taxes, but you know what they did? They contributed to the actual economy. And yes, low-skilled immigrants do that by taking care of kids and mowing lawns and picking crops, and all that stuff totally needs to be considered. And especially when you realize that most of the modern economy is services, and services generally can only be consumed by people who are in your immediate vicinity. So the main people benefit from immigrants running restaurants are natives, because who else is going to eat in those restaurants? Right now, this is, I admit, a very complicated question. That's why I put a lot of effort into it. I made a mistake in the book, and I'm just going to be honest. I made one mistake. There was one table where there's a footnote where I didn't read the footnote carefully, and I was corrected, and I wrote a post correcting it. Honestly, look, I would like to win the trust of anyone listening, including the trust of someone that doesn't agree with what I'm saying. And a big part of that in my mind is putting my worst foot forward and saying every mistake that I make. So you realize I'm not someone who just sits around saying I'm constantly vindicated by events. I am fallible. I have made mistakes, but I also, as a result, am prone to correcting them. And when I've gone through things many times, I think that I do have unusual reliability, although don't take my word for it. Buy the book and check the notes. It's all documented. So you can see whether I am being not just honest, but fully open with readers. There were a few parts in When Borders where my editor said, well, you don't really want to say this. It undermines your argument. So yeah, but it's true. So I'm not here to be a lawyer. I'm not here just to go and make a bunch of incompatible arguments and to cover up a bunch of inconvenient truths just trying to win. I'm here to get to the bottom of what's really going on.
And that's why the subtitle is always The Science and Ethics of Open Borders or Housing Regulation.
Yes.
I really recommend you guys read the books, especially if you don't agree with Bryan, all the more reason. And for those who do, you'll have some more ammo in your belt. So, Bryan, before we get to the lightning round where I just rattle off a bunch of kind of random topic questions and you answer, I want to know, how did you become so nice, so fair? You might be wrong, but you're always very fair. You've come up with this ideological Turing test. I'd like you to talk about that and maybe how you became so nice, so fair. I think anyone would love to have you as a confidant, friend, or teacher, Bryan Caplan.
Well, I love you too, Ben, but I wish it were so. Let's see. Like, I'm just going to start by saying none of this comes naturally at all to me. I was a rotten kid. I had a terrible attitude in high school. If you read stuff I wrote in high school, it just sounds like it's written by someone who's grew up in a prison or something. I was so bitter. I was like, what do you got to be bitter about, kid? Everything's fine. Like, no, it's terrible. So a lot of this comes from just trying to acknowledge my own personal failings and work against them. So like I am very prone to thinking that I'm always right. So yeah, I could lean into that and just become a typical demagogic pundit. Or I can say the very fact that I tend to have this overconfidence is a reason to triple and quadruple check my work, to read sentences and say, do I really know that's true? Or do I just want to believe that? So that's a big part of it. This ideological Turing test is an idea that I had. It's inspired by the much more famous regular Turing test. The regular Turing test was proposed by CS pioneer Alan Turing, and he said, look, suppose we want to decide whether a computer is capable of actually simulating human intelligence. How do we know? Well, it's not going to be a fair test if you just talk to a person and then talk to the computer and then have a person say, I don't think the computer's that good. So instead, the idea was, how about we go and blind it so that you don't know whether you're talking to a person or a computer? And then we say a computer has passed the Turing test if human audience cannot tell the difference at a better than chance level. Okay, so that's the original Turing test, right? And probably GPT is passing that Turing test with flying colors for a whole lot of things now. I mean, really, the main thing you got to do to not give away the store is to make it take a long time to give an answer, because GPT answers far too quickly and no human being is that knowledgeable. So there's that. Right. But anyway, the idea of the ideological Turing test, say, how about this is one where instead of computer versus human, it's human versus human. And here it's going to be a human who sincerely believes a view versus a human who does not accept that view, but claims to understand it well. And then instead of the audience being random humans, the ideal audience is actually a random selection of people who believe the doctrine. So we've got, say, Paul Krugman, progressive economist. And we've got me. I'm the challenger. These are the two contestants. And then what do we want to put in the audience? Let's put a whole bunch of progressive economists. Ideally, they're actually Paul Krugman's own students, his best students, his favorite students. We get these people. And then we blind it so that they can't see who's actually talking. And they feed us questions. And then we give out our answers. Now, I have passed the ideological Turing test for Krugman if the Krugmanians themselves cannot tell the difference between Krugman and me in the response from the responses. And in this case, I say it is totally fair for me to say, I understand Krugman's view. I understand his view as well as he understands it himself. And then the fact that I disagree, it doesn't show he's wrong, but at least it means that you should give me a hearing. It's like, yeah, I'm not disagreeing out of some kind of total obliviousness to your arguments. I'm disagreeing despite the fact that I understand what you're saying. I just think something else. And then just to make the contest really fair, then we flip the board around, and then he has to go and convince a bunch of my fans that he's me. So this was all originally inspired because Krugman did a video where he claimed not for me, but for what he called the conservative economist, which is itself a failure of the ideological Turing test, because there's almost no self-styled conservative economists in the world. There's free market economists. Like, I mean, that's really like someone saying, oh, I understand the pro-death position on abortion really well. Like, you're already using a word that would only be used by a pro-life person. You have given away your hand from the first sentence. Like, this is not the way you win this game. Come on. You could do better than that, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so anyway, Krugman claimed that non-progressive economists or free market economists didn't understand progressive economists, but progressive economists did understand free market economists. And I said, look, that's totally wrong. And honestly, the simple story is, look, in order to become an economics professor, you normally have to go to a top econ PhD program where you must know the Krugman view because that's taught by almost everybody. And on the other hand, you do not need to go to a free market university or have even a single class in these ideas in order to become Paul Krugman. So look, I think he's smarter than me. I'm totally willing. I think his IQ is super high. Someone says Paul Krugman's an idiot, say he might be a fool, but he's real smart. Right? There's different things. One's lacking in common sense and judgment. The other one is inability to learn with a gun to your head. And I think he's awesome on that second standard. Not that I want to put a gun to Paul's head. I've learned a lot from him, but just the hypothetical of if he had to, could he learn it? I think he totally could, but he hasn't because he doesn't feel like it.
And that's totally fair. I've met economists who would prescribe themselves as modern monetary theorists,
Yes.
MMT. And most people on the free market camp would say, these people are crazy. They just want to print money. Have they ever heard of inflation? That would be failing the ideological
Mm-hmm.
Turing test.
Mm-hmm.
These people have a sophisticated view, which I disagree with, but I
Yep.
could actually
Mm-hmm.
explain their views the way that they would say,
Yeah.
yes, that is totally what we believe. At the
Yes.
end, it comes down to, how you believe resources should be allocated in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're unable to, in their own words, pass
Yes.
the ideological Turing test,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably not arguing in good
Mm-hmm.
faith.
Yeah, we'll say 95% of people into MMT do have that idiot's view. And then there are the people who are actual professors who are into it, who are considerably less crazy, although ultimately still kind of crazy. But yeah.
Happy to have any of you guys on, the non-crazy ones, to discuss, and
Yes.
maybe we'll
I mean,
all
it's
pass
it's
the test.
also a hilarious example of giving your view a name that is not descriptive at all and just makes you sound like you're the only sensible person in the world. It's like, well, I believe in ancient monetary theory, like modern monetary theory. It's not modern monetary theory. It's held by almost no one in the modern world. So what are you talking about?
Well, we might need a couple of rebrands for the free market approach. Maybe, I don't know, modern classical theory, which obviously makes no sense.
Yes.
So
Right.
if we
Or
get
you
a
could
good
just
rebrand,
not try to prejudge it with labels and to be clear, which is one of my favorites. How about we just find the words that are currently being used that are well understood and say that and then defend it instead of trying to poison the well with a rebranding. Like
Brian,
we're not selling new Coke here, man.
well, some people are. Brian, let's get to the lightning round. I'm going to ask you a series of random questions on random topics. You'll give me 30 to a minute on what you think about it. Feel free to expand. Yes or no, underrated, overrated, whatever you're feeling. So, Brian, I was recently told, Ben, you're so smart and handsome and beautiful and all these great things. You should take an IQ test. But I've heard IQ tests are biased. What do you think? Is this true?
No, IQ tests are not biased in any important sense. They're not perfect, which is different. The main bias, which is small, that's been documented, is that the tests are biased against groups that do well on them. The opposite of what you heard. The tests are not biased against blacks. They're not biased against Hispanics. They're probably a little biased against Jews and Asians because if you actually were to go and use those tests for prediction of success in real world tasks, Jews and Asians do well on IQ tests, and they would do even better than their test scores indicate by a bit. Just to understand what that bias even means, a lot of the best research on possible bias in IQ tests comes from the military. And what they do there is they say, all right, look, let's first give you a paper and pencil IQ test, and then let's go and give people training in a practical skill like getting a score in a flight simulator or not crashing a plane or something like that. And then we will first of all use the paper and pencil IQ test to predict performance on the practical task. And for that, you can see that the test means something, definitely. People who have high scores in the test do better after the training class than people that didn't. And particularly, a lot of it is learning. You teach a skill they didn't know at all, where everyone was terrible initially, but the people with good scores on IQ tests improve a lot more, which fits what I think is the best working definition of intelligence, which is learning ability. You can be smart and know nothing about ancient Assyria. You can't be smart and study the history of ancient Assyria for a year and still not know anything about it, right? But the key thing that the military found was that there are that groups that do poorly on IQ tests also do correspondingly poorly on the practical task. And the only sign of bias really is that there are some groups that do especially well in IQ where it seems like they're even better at the practical task and learning it than the IQ test would suggest, although that's a small difference. But anyway, IQ tests are overall are not, but they're not perfect, but they are close to the best thing that we have for predicting trainability in a new task and also for predicting success of a kid who is yet less than 10. Considerably better than just using their parents' socioeconomic status or something like that.
I believe the book is there bias on IQ? It might be Arthur Jensen. We'll put that in the show notes for people interested. Yep. Okay,
and
next one,
factor,
Brian.
It's now almost 25 years out of date, but there's been some updates. But yeah, that book is awesome. But of course, more, and we keep learning more, but it's not very, it's not much different from the earlier stuff. Just dotting the I's, crossing the T's.
Bryan, next rapid fire question for you. AI is all the rage now. Do you think AI companions are going to make people more lonely or actually maybe less lonely because people can say,
Hmm.
hey, listen, I don't have any friends, but at least AI Ben and I can chat all night long. I can talk
Hmm.
to Milton Friedman or Bryan Caplan
Hmm.
AI. And,
Hmm.
if you're elderly, this is a great way to, have a friend. He's maybe a robot, but at least he's your
Hmm.
friend. What do you think? AI
Hmm.
will make people
Hmm.
more or less lonely?
As long as it's just text, then I think it will make them more lonely. The key thing about loneliness is that a lot of it is very much a primordial experience of face-to-face contact with other human beings, right? Or of course, a pet. People can be less lonely from pets. This is very basic to human beings. It's something where it seems to be one of the most important inputs into human happiness. And if it's just text, then I don't think it's going to be able to simulate, even if it's on a screen. I think what we saw during COVID was that Zooming with friends is not that good of a substitute for hanging out with them in real life. You may say, why is it so different? I'm not 100% sure that people who grow up on Zoom will feel the same as I do. I don't feel like I can adjust. Right. I mean, it's better than nothing, but I don't feel like I can just consider Zooming with a friend to be a close substitute for seeing them in person. But maybe someone who grows up with it will be different. My guess is not. It's just too fundamental to our existence as primates. But if it got to the level of virtual reality, then maybe even there's still the realization when you take the goggles off of, oh, I'm alone, and this is sort of fake. But maybe it doesn't mean that it's not better than nothing, right? So it's always worth remembering, better than nothing. And then the question is, will people then basically do the easy way out of I'm not going to go and invest and try to make real friends because I have this other thing, right? That, by the way, is like a lot of the when people say, "Well, like depression, it's so intractable," it's like it's not intractable. The real problem is that you have to make your life even worse to make it better. It's a lot like finding a job, right? You're depressed, but finding a job is even more depressing. But you'll feel better once you have a job. And a lot of life when you're struggling is making a conscious decision to make things even worse than they are right now in order that they can be better in the long run. And like impulse control is crucial, right? And also crucial for friendships in general. Your friend says something that hurts your feelings. Your impulse is to purge them and never be friends with them again. But but impulse control says, well, hold on, like they're a human being, they can't interact with other people without just accidentally going and hurting their feelings. I'm not perfect either. Like why? Like it's in my own best interest to forgive, and if I don't learn that, then I'm going to wind up being alone. I don't want that for myself.
Bryan Caplan, you are an economist at George Mason
Mm-hmm.
University. So I'm going to read some quotes from you, kind of about macroeconomic theory, and then we'll have a little chat. So you say, quote, it was bad to go off the gold standard, but there's no remotely safe way to go back. And
Mm-hmm.
then quote number two, despite the lull in economic crisis since the mid 80s, this was back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
the case for stripping governments entirely of their role in money remains strong. So
Mm-hmm.
let's take those two. You think,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we got off the gold standard, might be hard to get back, and we should still
Mm-hmm.
strip the
Mm-hmm.
government of their monetary
Mm-hmm.
powers. So, question. Obviously, I work in gold. We're working on
Mm-hmm.
bringing back a
Mm-hmm.
gold standard by paying interest in gold, but there's also crypto people as
Mm-hmm.
well who are trying to ask this kind of money question.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, how do we move from, paper money to some other form of money? What do you think are some tips you could offer those people, as well as some of the disastrous effects of the current policy that we're on
Mm-hmm.
now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say like just to back up. So what's the main danger going back on the gold standard? The main danger is what price do we go back at and which gold standard do we do? There's the 100% reserve standard where you basically could just define the existing money stock to be equal in value to the existing gold stock, right? That can be done. It basically consists in an overwhelming rise in the price of gold, which I guess all of your investors do any of your investors short gold?
No, so what we do at Monetary Metals is we pay interest on gold regardless of the price. So we're not shorting
Uh,
gold, we're not doing anything.
okay.
It's more of a
All
rental or a
right.
loan.
Yes. So look, if you do that, so that is one approach, 100% reserve, 100% gold reserve standard. It basically winds up then making the dollar worth next to nothing relative to gold, which again, I can see it being an interest of your clients, but so that is one approach. It's really extreme and pretty much winds up say sending out a big incentive to the world of let's mine every ounce of gold we can find right now because it's at a level, a price that is could easily be $100,000 an ounce, is like some astronomical price. On the other hand, if you go back to something more like the historic standard, then it's like, well, we'll go back at a lower price, and then it will be fraction reserve, and then it's like, well, like we got to go and get the price such that we do not lose our gold reserves, or else we're no longer on the gold standard. And that means that you've got to worry about all the historic problems of either inflation or deflation based upon this. So it really is a mess. Now, the case for just getting government out of this entirely, right? I think like the simplest one would just be to say, look, we're freezing the monetary base and that's it. We don't change the monetary base anymore. And whatever number of dollar bills exists right now is the amount for the rest of time. And otherwise we're not involved. That I think is less likely to end in disaster, but still nervous. Like say the main thing is that whatever complaints you have about the dollar, in the broad scheme of things, it doesn't get much better than the dollar. Even with the inflation the last few years, it doesn't get much better than the dollar. It's not true that under the gold standard, there's never inflation or deflation, right? So like, that if you go back far enough, then yeah, there were worse that happened too. It's one where I just don't see that there are very large gains to be made because the actual difference between things functioning great and right now is fairly small, where especially when you compare it to something like housing, right? Say the difference between the status quo and laissez-faire is astronomical, and it would be way better to have laissez-faire. But if you just say like under the gold standard, we'd have 0% inflation all the time. It's like, even if that were true, all right, that's a pretty small improvement over 2%. 2% is at a level where people really barely even notice. So I just don't think it's that big of a deal.
Yeah, Brian, I do agree with you. The inflation argument, prices used to be 2% less last year. I mean, obviously when inflation is impacting you, that is quite terrible. On the other hand, people are earning, inflation asset prices.
Yes.
I'll actually send you, it'll be in the show notes, a strategy that we have come up with, CEO Keith Weiner, on exchanging dollar bonds for gold bonds, because in general, like you said, just price fixing schemes where you say the dollar's worth this much amount of gold, those always run into problems. This is the way to actually convert dollar bonds into gold bonds. We'll put that in the description for anyone interested. Okay, Brian, final rapid fire question here. Javier Milei is a self-described anarcho-capitalist. Most people 2 years ago would have said, I don't even know what that is, but I hear the word anarchy and that sounds bad. And most people don't like capitalism. So that's just two bad things combined into one. But Javier Milei is the president of Argentina, self-described anarcho-capitalists. Things seem to be going well there, but is this a lose-lose situation? If things go well, people can always just write him off and say it was a lucky fluke. And if things go horribly, they can say, see, this is why we shouldn't have had capitalism in the first place. So what are your thoughts on anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei?
I did actually spend quite a bit of time in January just going over everything that was not that you could know about him then. The main thing is, we'll just to back up. So how did he win given this bizarrely unpopular view? Yeah, some combination of Argentina is having a disaster, plus he has some incredible personal charisma that seems to really appeal to Argentinians anyway. I would be scared by a guy waving a chainsaw around, but apparently there's cool. So it's kind of weird. Like maybe there's going to be a country where being a bucktooth nerd with thick glasses is going to be cool next. Who knows? Right. But anyway, that is one of the least studied aspects of politics by economists, is just how sheer personal charisma can get a guy elected whose views are actually abhorrent to most voters. Because economists normally figure people are voting for policies, whereas it's like, no, it's like, a lot of it is just the tude of the guy. I like the cut of that guy's jib. All right. In terms of whether it's a lose-lose proposition, I don't think so. I think, if things go well, then it is at least a point in favor, and people can say you just got lucky, but that always sounds kind of lame. Right now, things go poorly. Just given how poorly Argentina's been going, it's a point against, but it's also one where you can say, look, the guy took over in a total disaster. So what does it really show? In the Soviet Union, or rather post-Soviet Russia, there it really was a case where the free market wound up getting blamed for a bunch of stuff that was inevitable and just part and parcel of a massive transformation of the economy. Part of why I think it was so negatively spun was just that there were so many people who were so angry about the move away from socialism in the Eastern Bloc, and they were actually fans the whole time and cheerleaders, and then they felt so humiliated and they were just looking for anything to complain about. So there's that. Maybe they'll get away with that for Argentina. I don't think they have the same global army of apologists that the Soviet bloc had. So, just never underestimate the power of the Soviet propaganda machine. Even to this day, when you go and read US history textbooks, you'll see there's a bunch of very minor incidents in American history that still get a page. And these were on a list that the Communist Party put out in the 30s and 40s of just particular episodes in American history to never shut up about. And they got people to really talk about them because you read it's like, well, what does that prove? All right. Yeah, it doesn't prove it. So like execution of Julius Rosenberg actually turned out he was a spy. His wife, maybe not, but she didn't know anything. All right. Seems hard to believe.
There are actually a couple of people who helped Keynes, I think, to transition us from a
Harry Dexter White, right?
Harry Dexter White. He helped transition us from a more gold standard economy towards a more kind of centralized and paper standard economy. Turns out he was a communist spy. So all of the kind of communist spy stuff turned out to actually be true.
Well, not all, some, but yes, it real. Like when you at the time, I don't think anyone of importance was so naive to think there were no communist spies. When you go and get a education in a U.S. history class today, I think you actually do get the impression that it was all made up. And again, we're not talking just passing some secrets about our agricultural policy. We are talking about people passing nuclear weapons secrets, which is a big deal.
Yeah, and I think one thing to remember, at least for people my age and maybe even people your age, Brian, most of the stuff taught in school is about the Mayan civilization, and in after in the 1920s there was prohibition, which some of that is important stuff to learn and interesting.
It's amazing to get to the 20th century, actually.
Totally, but on the other hand, we pretty much stop around there, and then Mao, Stalin, those guys, we never really talk about them, even though body count wise, they had some of the most historic kill counts of all time. Seems a bit odd. So, okay, maybe final question here. Why do you think that people hate people like developers, capitalists, people who make a lot of money, but tend to kind of excuse or maybe even wear a Che Guevara shirt when these people are horrible people by any other standard?
Yeah, this is a deep question. And I think it comes down to this. There is a very deep set psychological tendency that I call anti-market bias. It's been a big theme of my work, where again, it's that people just have a deep psychological aversion and some of them, they just have antipathy for markets in general, and especially people who succeed in markets. Now, as to why that is, I don't have any really good story. There's an economist, Paul Rubin, who says, well, it makes sense because when you're a primitive tribe, then trade is just a way of ripping people off. And it's like, no, it wasn't. Right? You could say like you're close to subsistence, so there isn't really any gain to trade. Like, look, it's when you're close to subsistence that any gain at all matters the most. So I don't think there's any really good story here, but it still seems to go back many thousands of years, and I don't know any of culture that doesn't have it. I think about socialism as taking this basic human psychology and turning it into a philosophy. But long before there was socialism, there's still deep resentment of markets and the rich, and in particular, rich people who make their money through markets. But ultimately, I think it is a fact that human beings don't like hearing about someone making their money through trade, that they have a lot of just deep negativity towards them. You can see this when you have even very left-wing billionaires who've given a lot of money to left-wing causes, and then read what the left-wing media says about them, and they hate them. It's like, you can't win. Jeff Bezos can be trashed in The Nation, even though he's given a pile of money to left-wing causes. Just the fact that he earned his money by creating the best store in all of human history marks him as a bad guy. Right? And it seems crazy to me, but this is not just something that has been foisted upon American kids by left-wing teachers in the last couple of decades. They made it worse, but it's very basic human nature. I just don't know why.
Well, anyone who is super rich loves the free market and is interested in learning more about gold standard,
and wants to get more rich, right?
And wants to get more rich, check out monetary-metals.com. Bryan, where can people find more of your book? I highly recommend Build
Mhm.
Baby Build, Open Borders. Pretty much every book Bryan's ever written
Awesome.
is really fun. So
All right.
get those while you
Pretty,
can.
pretty
Bryan, where can they
much,
find
Ben.
them?
What do you mean pretty much? Just kidding. But yeah, so all my books are on Amazon, and then Build Baby Build supposed to be everywhere, Barnes & Noble, all those other stores too.
Bryan, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be catching your book. Leave a comment in the description of the video. Tell us what you thought if you've read some of Bryan's book, and we'll have to have you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
This episode was brought to you by Monetary Metals. Monetary Metals is a different kind of gold company. Others buy and sell gold. Monetary Metals operates the Gold Yield Marketplace, a platform of products that offer a yield on gold paid in gold to investors and institutions, and are gold financing simplified, reliable financing denominated in gold with a built-in hedge for gold-using and gold-producing businesses. To learn more, visit www.monetary-metals.com.